In the shadowed corridors of European palaces, where dynasties rose and fell on the promise of legitimate heirs, one royal marriage would become the most whispered scandal of the 19th century. For 13 years, two cousins shared a bed, a title, and a terrible secret that threatened to destroy the oldest monarchy in Europe. Their names were Louis Antoine, Duke of Angoulême, and Marie-Thérèse, daughter of the executed King Louis XVI. To the world, they appeared as the perfect royal couple, devoted to restoring the Bourbon dynasty after the horrors of the French Revolution. Behind palace doors, according to contemporary medical reports, they lived as strangers, their union unconsummated for over a decade, while Europe watched and whispered. The scandal began not with passion, but with deception. Historical records reveal that their marriage was built on a lie so calculated, so cruel, that it would poison their relationship from the very beginning. Louis Antoine's uncle, the self-proclaimed King Louis XVI, had convinced Marie-Thérèse to marry her cousin by telling her it was her dead parents' final wish. Contemporary sources confirm this was completely fabricated. Neither Louis XV nor Marie Antoinette had ever expressed such a desire. Yet this deception would bind two traumatized souls in a union that historians describe as one of the most dysfunctional in royal history. What made their situation even more desperate was the weight of dynastic expectation crushing down upon them. The Bourbon family had been decimated by revolution and exile. They needed heirs, and they needed them desperately. Yet according to doctors' reports preserved in historical archives, something was terribly wrong. The couple, married in 1799, remained childless year after year, while European courts began to whisper about their failure. If you're finding this story as shocking as I am, make sure to subscribe for more hidden royal scandals that reveal the dark secrets behind Europe's most powerful families, because what we're about to uncover gets even more disturbing. Contemporary accounts describe Louis Antoine as weak, indecisive, and thoroughly inadequate for royal responsibilities. The historian Guillaume Berthier de Sauvigny documented that he suffered from what appears to be severe psychological issues, describing him as having a full-grown inferiority complex. His wife, meanwhile, bore the scars of unimaginable trauma. Marie-Thérèse had witnessed her parents' execution, survived nearly 2 years of solitary confinement as a teenager, and emerged from prison emotionally shattered and withdrawn. Their wedding night in 1799 marked the beginning of what would become one of history's longest royal scandals. For 13 years, European courts watched and waited for news of a pregnancy that never came. Diplomats wrote coded letters about the couple's difficulties. Court physicians were quietly consulted. The pressure mounted with each passing year as the future of the Bourbon dynasty hung in the balance. But in 1812, something changed. Medical records confirm that the couple finally consummated their marriage, and by December, Marie-Thérèse was pregnant for the first time. The news shocked European nobility, who had begun to whisper that the union was beyond hope. Louise de Condé wrote to her father about her shock and astonishment at the pregnancy announcement. Yet even this apparent triumph would end in tragedy, revealing just how cursed this marriage truly was. Because what happened next would expose the depths of their dysfunction and set in motion the events that would destroy the Bourbon dynasty forever. Louis Antoine d'Artois was born into privilege at the Palace of Versailles on August 6, 1775, but his childhood would be defined by terror, flight, and the collapse of everything his family had ever known. As the eldest son of the Count of Artois, he was destined for a life of royal comfort and traditional education. Instead, historians document that he became one of the first royal children to experience the full psychological devastation of revolutionary upheaval, a trauma that would shape his inadequate character for the rest of his life. The first 14 years of Louis Antoine's existence passed in relative normalcy. Contemporary accounts describe a typical royal education at the Château de Beauregard, overseen by his governor, the Marquis de Serran. He studied alongside his younger brother Charles Ferdinand, learning languages, military tactics, and the complex etiquette that governed royal behavior. Yet those who knew him even then noted something troubling about the young prince. Historical sources, suggest he was already showing signs of the weakness that would later define him. Indecisive, easily overwhelmed, and lacking the natural authority expected of a future king. Then came July 1789, and everything changed. When the Bastille fell and revolutionary fervor swept through France, Louis Antoine's father made a decision that would traumatize his children for life. According to historical records, on July 16 to 1789, the Count of Artois fled France with his wife and 2 young sons, abandoning their homeland in the middle of the night. 13-year-old Louis Antoine watched his family's world collapse as they raced through loyalist territories, evading revolutionary patrols who wanted their blood. The escape itself reads like a nightmare. Documents show the family crossed into Savoy, reaching Turin by July 17th, where they received asylum from Victor Amadeus III. But this was only the beginning of what would become decades of rootless wandering. Contemporary sources revealed that the young prince, torn from everything familiar, began exhibiting the psychological fragility that would plague him throughout his life. Unlike his more resilient younger brother, Louis Antoine seemed to crack under the pressure of exile. What followed were years of humiliating dependence on foreign courts. Historical accounts detail how the family moved from Germany to England to Russia, always as refugees, always at the mercy of others. The boy who should have been preparing to rule France was instead learning the bitter lessons of powerlessness. Historians suggest this constant instability, combined with his naturally weak constitution, created a perfect storm of psychological damage. By 1792, desperate to prove himself, 17-year-old Louis Antoine joined the émigré army of his cousin, the Prince of Condé. Military records show he fought against his own countrymen, Frenchmen killing Frenchmen, while the boy watched his homeland tear itself apart. Contemporary accounts describe him as brave enough in battle, but already showing signs of the indecisiveness that would later make him such an ineffective leader. The most devastating blow came in 1795, when the young prince led what historical sources describe as a catastrophic royalist uprising in the Vendée. The mission failed spectacularly, and Louis Antoine was forced to flee in disgrace. Those who witnessed his retreat noted his visible breakdown. This was a young man clearly unequipped for the responsibilities thrust upon him. But the worst trauma was still to come, because soon his uncle would devise a plan so cruel, so calculated, that it would destroy any chance Louis Antoine had of finding happiness or strength. A deception involving the one person who might have understood his suffering, his traumatized cousin, Marie-Thérèse. By 1799, the Bourbon family had suffered devastating losses. King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette had been guillotined, their 10-year-old son had died in prison, and the only surviving child of the royal bloodline was Marie-Thérèse, a traumatized 20-year-old woman who had endured horrors that would have broken most people. She had watched her parents be dragged to their execution, survived nearly 2 years of solitary confinement in the Temple prison, and emerged psychologically shattered. Now, her uncle Louis XV saw in her damaged niece the perfect pawn for his dynastic schemes. Historical records reveal that Louis XVI's plan was as calculated as it was cruel. He needed to secure the Bourbon succession, and that meant binding Marie-Thérèse to his nephew Louis Antoine. But he knew that an honest proposal might be rejected. After all, why would this traumatized young woman want to marry a cousin she barely knew? So according to contemporary sources, he devised a lie so manipulative that it would poison their relationship from the very beginning. The setting for this deception was Mitau Palace in present-day Latvia, where Tsar Paul I had granted the exiled French royal family sanctuary. When Marie-Thérèse arrived at the palace in early 1799, she was emotionally vulnerable and desperate for any connection to her murdered parents. Historical accounts describe her as withdrawn, austere, and haunted by memories of revolutionary terror. Her uncle understood her psychological state perfectly and exploited it with clinical precision. According to documented sources, Louis XVI told his niece that he had a final message for her from her dead parents. Their greatest wish, he claimed, was that she would marry her cousin Louis Antoine, the Duke of Angoulême. The lie was devastating in its simplicity. Marie-Thérèse, eager to honor any request from her martyred mother and father, agreed to the marriage immediately. Contemporary records confirm this was completely fabricated. Neither Louis XVI nor Marie Antoinette had ever expressed such a desire. What makes this deception even more horrific is that both young people were psychologically damaged. Louis Antoine suffered from what historians describe as severe confidence issues and indecisiveness, while Marie-Thérèse bore the scars of unimaginable trauma. They were two broken souls being forced together, not for love or compatibility, but for cold political calculation. Historical sources suggest that neither was emotionally prepared for marriage, let alone the pressure of producing heirs for a dying dynasty. The wedding took place on June 10, 1799, at Jelgava Palace. Contemporary accounts describe a somber ceremony. There was little joy in this union built on deception and necessity. Jean-Charles Tardieu's 1816 depiction of the wedding shows the couple looking formal and distant, already suggesting the dysfunction that would define their relationship. From their wedding night onward, something was terribly wrong. Court observers noted the couple's strange formality with each other, their lack of warmth, their apparent inability to connect on any meaningful level. Historians suggest that the trauma both had endured, combined with the manipulative circumstances of their union, created an impossible foundation for intimacy. But the true extent of their dysfunction wouldn't become clear until years passed, and European courts began to whisper about something unprecedented. A royal couple who seemed incapable of producing the very heirs, their dynasty desperate. What happened next would become one of the most whispered scandals in European royal history. From their wedding night in 1799, Louis Antoine and Marie-Thérèse began living what contemporary observers described as the strangest marriage in royal circle. They shared title, public appearances, and even beds. But according to medical records that would later surface, they lived as complete strangers. For 13 years, the Duke and Duchess of Angoulême maintained the facade of a royal marriage, while European courts watched in growing bewilderment as no children appeared. The silence from their household was deafening, in an era when royal pregnancies were announced with fanfare and celebrated across continents. The Angoulême couple produced nothing but awkward explanations and diplomatic diversions. Historical sources reveal that by 1805, foreign ambassadors were writing coded dispatches about the couple's peculiar domestic arrangements. Court physicians were quietly consulted. European nobility began placing bets on whether the marriage would ever produce an heir. Contemporary accounts describe the couple's public appearances as painfully formal. They attended state functions together, sat side by side at royal dinners, and maintained all the external trappings of matrimony, but those who observed them noted an unmistakable coldness between them. Marie-Thérèse, already emotionally withdrawn from her revolutionary trauma, seemed to treat her husband more like a distant acquaintance than a spouse. Louis Antoine, meanwhile, appeared increasingly uncomfortable and defensive when questions about children arose. Tell me in the comments what part of this story shocks you the most so far. And if you're enjoying this documentary, make sure to subscribe for more stories like this. The pressure mounted with each passing year. Historical records show that Louis XVI grew increasingly desperate as his dynastic plans crumbled before his eyes. The couple he had manipulated into marriage was failing to fulfill the most basic royal duty, producing heirs. Diplomatic correspondence from the period reveals growing concern among European courts about the stability of the Bourbon restoration if no legitimate children emerged from this union. Behind palace doors, the situation was even more disturbing. Sources suggest that both Louis Antoine and Marie-Thérèse seemed actively to avoid intimacy. Servants noted that they maintained separate bedrooms, met only for formal meals, and conducted their marriage like a business arrangement. The psychological damage both had suffered appeared to have created an insurmountable barrier to any genuine connection. By 1810, the whispers had become impossible to ignore. Foreign courts were openly speculating about whether the marriage would ever be consummated. Some suggested that Louis Antoine's psychological weakness made him incapable of fulfilling his marital duties. Others pointed to Marie-Thérèse's trauma as the source of their dysfunction. The truth, historians now believe, was likely both. The scandal reached its peak when doctors were finally called in to examine the situation. Medical professionals who had dealt with royal fertility issues were discreetly consulted about what could be done to resolve the couple's difficulties. The very fact that such intervention was necessary after more than a decade of marriage shocked even the most jaded court observers. But then, in 1812, something extraordinary happened. After 13 years of marriage, medical records suddenly documented that the couple had finally consummated their union. The news would send shockwaves through European nobility and briefly restore hope for the Bourbon dynasty. The consummation of their marriage in 1812 didn't happen by accident. It was the result of desperate family intervention into what historical sources describe as one of the most psychologically damaged relationships in royal history. For 13 years, Louis Antoine and Marie-Thérèse had lived together while remaining emotional and physical strangers, their separate traumas creating an insurmountable wall between them. Contemporary accounts reveal that by 1811, the situation had become so dire that the family was forced to take drastic action to save the Bourbon succession. Historical records suggest that Marie-Thérèse's revolutionary trauma had left her with what modern psychologists would recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. She had watched her parents be dragged to execution, survived nearly 2 years of solitary confinement as a teenager, and emerged from prison emotionally shut down. Contemporary observers described her as austere, withdrawn, and seemingly incapable of normal human warmth. The idea of physical intimacy appears to have been genuinely terrifying for someone whose formative experiences involved violation, imprisonment, and loss of all control. Louis Antoine's psychological damage manifested differently, but was equally crippling. Sources from the period describe a man paralyzed by indecision and self-doubt, someone who had internalized years of failure and humiliation during their exile. Military records show that while he was brave in battle, he consistently crumbled under personal pressure. Historians suggest that the responsibility of being intimate with his traumatized wife, combined with the enormous dynastic pressure to produce heirs, may have rendered him psychologically impotent. The breaking point came in 1811, when Napoleon's empire began to falter, and the possibility of Bourbon restoration suddenly became real. Historical sources reveal that Louis XVI realized his carefully orchestrated marriage had been a complete failure, and that desperate measures were required. According to contemporary accounts, family physicians were called in to address what court documents diplomatically referred to as the couple's marital difficulties. What happened next remains partially shrouded in historical mystery, but medical records confirm that professional intervention was involved. Some sources suggest that doctors provided both psychological counseling and possibly medical assistance to help the couple overcome their dysfunction. Others hint at more direct intervention, perhaps even supervising their initial attempts at intimacy to ensure success. The pressure applied to both spouses appears to have been enormous. Contemporary accounts describe Louis XVI essentially commanding the couple to fulfill their dynastic duty, while family members made it clear that the survival of their entire bloodline depended on their success. For two people already psychologically fragile, this additional pressure must have been overwhelming. The transformation that occurred in 1812 was as sudden as it was shocking. After 13 years of apparent celibacy, medical records document that Louis Antoine and Marie-Thérèse finally consummated their marriage. The timing wasn't coincidental. It occurred precisely when Napoleon's Russian campaign was collapsing and Bourbon restoration seemed possible for the first time in decades. By December 1812, the impossible had happened. Marie-Thérèse was pregnant. The news sent shockwaves through European courts, where nobility had given up hope of ever seeing an heir from this dysfunctional union. But their celebration would be premature, because this pregnancy would end in a tragedy that would destroy what little remained of their already fractured relationship. The pregnancy announcement in December 1812 sent shockwaves through European nobility who had long given up hope on the Bourbon succession. After 13 years of barren marriage, the impossible had happened. Marie-Thérèse, now 34 years old, was finally expecting a child. Contemporary letters reveal the astonishment this news created among court circles. Louise de Condé wrote to her father expressing her shock and astonishment concerning the Duchess's pregnancy, while Princess Charlotte of Wales noted Marie-Thérèse's sudden transformation from withdrawn melancholy to cautious optimism. Historical sources reveal that the family's reaction bordered on hysteria. Louis XVI, who had orchestrated this marriage through deception, suddenly saw vindication for his cruel manipulations. The uncle who had lied about her parents' wishes now positioned himself as the architect of Bourbon's salvation. Court documents from the period show that every aspect of Marie-Thérèse's pregnancy was monitored, controlled, and managed like a military operation designed to ensure the dynasty's survival. The pressure placed on the expectant mother was enormous and unprecedented. Medical records indicate that Monsieur Lefebvre, the court physician, was in constant attendance, documenting every detail of her condition. François Hue received regular updates that he dutifully recorded. At this moment, I'm tending to a woman who lives above me and who is pregnant for the first time after more than 13 years of marriage. The clinical language barely concealed the family's desperate anxiety about whether this pregnancy would actually produce a living heir. Contemporary accounts describe an atmosphere of barely controlled panic within the royal household. This wasn't just any pregnancy. This was potentially the last chance for legitimate Bourbon succession. Marie-Thérèse, already emotionally fragile, now carried the weight of an entire dynasty's survival in her womb. Historical sources suggest that the psychological pressure may have been more than any woman could reasonably bear, let alone one already traumatized by years of revolutionary horror. Meanwhile, Louis Antoine appeared to be crumbling under the scrutiny. Sources from the period describe him as increasingly anxious and defensive as the pregnancy progressed. He had finally fulfilled his basic marital duty after 13 years of failure, but now faced the even more terrifying prospect of actually becoming a father and continuing the bloodline that had nearly been extinguished by revolution. The family's desperation manifested in obsessive attention to every detail. Historical records show that plans were made for the birth, announcements were prepared, and celebrations were cautiously arranged. European courts watched with fascination as the Bourbon family dared to hope that their dysfunctional marriage might actually save their dynasty. But beneath the surface optimism lay a terrible anxiety that no one dared voice publicly. Marie-Thérèse was 34 years old in an era when such late pregnancies carried enormous risks. She had endured years of psychological trauma that had left her emotionally and physically damaged. The very intervention required to achieve this pregnancy suggested underlying health issues that could complicate childbirth. As the months passed and her pregnancy progressed, the family's hopes soared, but their fears grew even stronger. Because what happened in the spring of 1813 would shatter their dreams and destroy what remained of this already broken marriage forever. In the spring of 1813, as Napoleon's empire crumbled and Bourbon restoration seemed within reach, the impossible dream of the Angoulême marriage finally collapsed into nightmare. Sometime between late February and June, after months of desperate hope and obsessive medical attention, Marie-Thérèse gave birth to a stillborn child at Hartwell House in Buckinghamshire. The baby, who was supposed to save the Bourbon dynasty, never drew a single breath. Historical records document this as one of the most devastating losses in royal history. Not just the death of a child, but the death of an entire family's future. Contemporary accounts describe the aftermath as psychologically catastrophic for both parents. Marie-Thérèse, who had endured 13 years of marriage dysfunction, the pressure of a late pregnancy, and the weight of dynastic expectation, suffered what sources suggest was a complete emotional breakdown. The woman who had already survived her parents' execution and years of imprisonment now faced the loss of her only child, the one thing that might have given meaning to her traumatic existence. For Louis Antoine, the stillbirth represented the ultimate confirmation of his inadequacy. Historical sources suggest that he had always doubted his ability to fulfill his royal duties. And now his failure seemed complete. After 13 years of marriage difficulties and months of anxiety about becoming a father, he had produced only death. Contemporary observers noted his visible deterioration in the weeks following the tragedy, describing a man who appeared broken by the weight of dynastic failure. The family's reaction was swift and merciless. Louis XVI, who had orchestrated this marriage through deception and manipulation, now saw his carefully laid plans destroyed. Court documents from the period reveal growing frustration with Louis Antoine's inability to provide the succession that the Restoration desperately needed. The uncle who had once seen his nephew as a useful tool now began to view him as a liability to Bourbon survival. What made the tragedy even more devastating was the medical consensus that this would likely be Marie-Thérèse's only chance at motherhood. At 34, having endured a traumatic late pregnancy that ended in stillbirth, contemporary physicians held little hope for future successful pregnancies. Historical sources suggest that both spouses understood the implications. Their marriage had not only failed to produce an heir, but had probably destroyed any future possibility of doing so. The psychological damage to their relationship was irreparable. Sources from the period described the couple retreating into even deeper emotional isolation after the stillbirth. They had briefly connected enough to conceive a child, but the loss of that child seemed to destroy whatever fragile bond they had managed to create. Contemporary accounts described them returning to their previous pattern of formal coexistence, but now with the added weight of shared grief and mutual blame. European courts watched this unfolding tragedy with a mixture of sympathy and political calculation. Diplomatic correspondence from the period reveals growing concerns about Bourbon succession and the stability of any future restoration. The couple who had once inspired hope now became symbols of dynastic failure. But the worst was yet to come, because when the Bourbon Restoration finally arrived in 1814, Louis Antoine would face political pressures that would expose just how completely unsuited he was for the role destiny had assigned him. The Bourbon Restoration of 1814 should have been Louis Antoine's moment of redemption. After years of exile, marriage dysfunction, and personal failure, he finally had the chance to prove his worth to the dynasty. Instead, historical records document a series of catastrophic political and military failures that would confirm his reputation as the most inadequate heir in French royal history. His performance during the Restoration was so disastrous that it set the stage for one of the most humiliating abdications in European history. When Louis Antoine returned to France in March 1814, contemporary sources describe his entry into Bordeaux as promising. The city had declared for the king, and his arrival was seen as the beginning of Bourbon restoration. Historical accounts note that he fought alongside the Duke of Wellington and showed competence in military operations against Napoleon's crumbling empire. For a brief moment, it seemed that exile and personal tragedy might have strengthened his character. But the illusion of competence shattered completely during Napoleon's return in 1815. As chief of the Royalist army in the southern Rhone Valley, Louis Antoine was given the crucial responsibility of preventing Napoleon's march to Paris. Historical records document his complete failure in this mission. Napoleon's forces swept through southern France, while Louis Antoine's army melted away, unable to mount effective resistance against the returning emperor. Contemporary accounts describe Louis Antoine's behavior during this crisis as pathetically inadequate. Military reports suggest he appeared paralyzed by indecision, unable to make the quick strategic decisions necessary to stop Napoleon's advance. Officers noted his visible anxiety and his tendency to defer critical choices to subordinates. The man who should have been leading the resistance instead became a symbol of royal weakness and incompetence. The political implications were devastating. Louis XVI had entrusted his nephew with a mission that could determine the fate of the Restoration, and Louis Antoine had failed spectacularly. Historical sources reveal growing family frustration with his performance. The uncle who had once seen potential in his nephew now viewed him as a liability to Bourbon survival. During the 100 days of Napoleon's return, Louis Antoine was forced to flee once again to Britain, adding another humiliating exile to his already dismal record. Contemporary diplomatic correspondence reveals that European allies were beginning to question whether the Bourbon family possessed the strength necessary to govern France effectively. When the restoration was finally secured after Waterloo, Louis Antoine's reputation was permanently damaged. Military and political observers noted his lack of natural authority, his inability to inspire confidence, and his tendency to crumble under pressure. Historical sources suggest that even his own family had lost faith in his ability to lead. By 1830, when revolution again threatened the Bourbon monarchy, these accumulated failures would prove decisive. Louis Antoine had spent decades demonstrating his inadequacy, and when the July Revolution erupted, everyone, including his own family, understood that he was not the man to save the dynasty. The moment of ultimate humiliation was approaching, when this failed prince would face the choice between fighting for his throne and walking away in shame. His decision would shock Europe and earn him a place in history as the king who reigned for less than 20 minutes. On August 2nd, 1830, at the Château de Rambouillet outside Paris, one of the most extraordinary moments in royal history unfolded. King Charles II, facing revolutionary mobs in the streets and political collapse, signed his abdication in favor of his grandson, the young Duke of Bordeaux. For exactly 20 minutes, Louis Antoine held the crown of France as King Louis XIX. Then, in what historians describe as the most rapid abdication in European history, he signed away his rights to the throne, making him both the shortest reigning and most humiliated monarch in French royal records. Contemporary accounts describe the scene as pathetic and devastating. Historical sources reveal that Louis Antoine hesitated for those crucial 20 minutes while his wife Marie-Thérèse begged him not to abdicate. She understood what he apparently didn't, that this decision would brand him forever as a coward and a failure. But after decades of psychological inadequacy, military disasters, and personal humiliation, Louis Antoine made the choice that confirmed every suspicion about his weakness. The reasons for his abdication reveal the depth of his psychological damage. Historical records suggest that Louis Antoine simply couldn't face the responsibility of fighting for his throne. After witnessing his father's failed attempts to govern, his own catastrophic military performance during the 100 Days, and the family's repeated disappointment in his leadership, the prospect of actual kingship appears to have terrified him beyond reason. What makes his decision even more shameful is that it wasn't entirely his to make. By abdicating, Louis Antoine essentially stole the throne from his nephew, the Duke of Bordeaux, who should have inherited directly from Charles VI. Contemporary sources suggest that the family was furious about this betrayal. He had not only failed to fight for his own crown, but had also compromised his nephew's legitimate claim. The aftermath was swift and merciless. Historical accounts describe Louis Antoine and Marie-Thérèse's departure from France as a final humiliating exile. They traveled first to Edinburgh, where they took residence at 21 Regent Terrace near Holyrood Palace. Living as refugees from a throne Louis Antoine had abandoned without a fight. European courts watched in astonishment as the man who could have been king instead chose the life of an exile. The psychological toll on both spouses appears to have been enormous. Sources from their Edinburgh period describe a couple completely broken by the weight of their failures. Marie-Thérèse, who had survived revolution, imprisonment, and personal tragedy, now faced the additional shame of being married to a man who had voluntarily given up a crown. Louis Antoine, meanwhile, seemed to retreat completely into himself, becoming what observers described as a shadow of his already inadequate former self. In 1832, Emperor Francis I offered the royal couple refuge at Prague Castle, and they moved there seeking anonymity and escape from their shameful reputation. Historical records show that even in exile, Louis Antoine continued to disappoint. He provided no leadership to the legitimist cause, offered no inspiration to Bourbon supporters, and seemed content to fade into obscurity rather than fight for restoration. The man who had once been positioned as the savior of the Bourbon dynasty had become its greatest embarrassment. Contemporary accounts describe him as a living symbol of royal failure, a prince who had been given every advantage and squandered every opportunity. But death would not bring him peace, because history would remember him not for any achievement, but for the 20 minutes when he held absolute power and chose to surrender it rather than fight. Louis Antoine, Duke of Angoulême, died on June 3, 1844, in Gurz, Austrian Empire, at the age of 68. There was no royal procession, no state funeral, no ceremonial mourning befitting a former Dauphin of France. Historical records document his burial in his father's crypt at the Franciscan monastery of Kostanjevica in Slovenia, a final exile even in death. The man who had once held the crown of France for 20 minutes was interred quietly, almost secretively, as if his family wanted the world to forget he had ever existed. Contemporary accounts reveal that even his death was treated as an embarrassment by the remaining Bourbon family. There were no grand eulogies celebrating his life, no attempts to rehabilitate his reputation posthumously. Instead, historical sources suggest that his family was simply relieved to be free of a constant reminder of their dynasty's failures. Louis Antoine had become living proof that royal bloodlines offered no guarantee of competence, courage, or character. The legacy he left behind was devastating for monarchist credibility. European courts had witnessed a prince who possessed every advantage: noble birth, quality education, military training, and political opportunity, yet consistently failed at every crucial moment. Historical records show that his story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of hereditary rule when bloodlines produced inadequate leaders. What makes his story particularly tragic is how it reflects the broader collapse of traditional monarchy in the face of modern political realities. Louis Antoine represented everything wrong with the old system: a man elevated by birth rather than merit, protected by privilege rather than proven by performance. Contemporary observers noted that his failures weren't just personal, they were systemic, revealing the fundamental weakness of dynasties that relied on genetic lottery rather than democratic selection. His marriage to Marie-Thérèse became a symbol of how royal families sacrificed individual happiness for political calculation. Two traumatized people had been manipulated into a union built on deception, forced to perform intimacy under medical supervision, and ultimately destroyed by the weight of dynastic expectation. Historical sources suggest their story influenced growing criticism of arranged royal marriages throughout the 19th century. Perhaps most damaging was how Louis Antoine's 20-minute abdication exposed the psychological reality behind royal mystique. For centuries, monarchs had claimed divine right and natural authority, but here was absolute proof that royal blood meant nothing when character was absent. Contemporary political theorists used his example to argue for constitutional limitations on monarchical power and democratic accountability in government. The final irony of his life was that his greatest contribution to history was negative. He demonstrated why hereditary monarchy was a dangerous anachronism. His story revealed the cruelty of a system that elevated unworthy individuals to positions of enormous responsibility while sacrificing their humanity to political necessity. His death marked the end of an era when royal families could hide their failures behind palace walls and court ceremony. The modern world was demanding transparency, competence, and accountability from its leaders, qualities that Louis Antoine never possessed and his dynasty never required. If this story has shocked you as much as it shocked me, make sure to subscribe for more hidden royal scandals that expose the dark truths behind Europe's most powerful families, because the secrets they tried to bury are finally coming to light.